Keanu Reeves stood in the first-class line, dressed plainly, a sharp contrast to the surrounding luxury. A man nearby, his arrogance clear as day, observed him with contempt. What happened next would leave the entire plane in stunned silence and alter one life forever. Before we dive into the story, let us know where you're tuning in from. If you enjoy stories like this, be sure to subscribe. We have something special lined up for tomorrow. At Los Angeles International Airport, the usual hustle and bustle filled the air. People rushing, conversations overlapping, luggage wheels clattering across the floor. Amid this chaos, one man stood quietly in the first-class line. Keanu Reeves. His outfit was modest, a flannel shirt, worn jeans and scuffed boots. He carried a backpack that looked like it had seen every corner of the globe. Nothing about him screamed wealth or fame, which allowed him to blend in unnoticed. But a closer look revealed something unique. It wasn't just his simple attire. It was the sense of calm he carried. While others fidgeted or anxiously checked their watches, Keanu stood there, radiating serenity. He seemed unaffected by the frenzy around him, as though he existed in a world untouched by stress. Observing everything with quiet curiosity, he soaked in the moment, unfazed by the occasional glances his way. Standing right behind him in line was Henry Frank. Henry was the complete opposite of Keanu, decked out in an expensive suit, polished shoes, and a cologne that announced his presence. He exuded the confidence of someone used to being noticed. His every movement was deliberate, calculated, clearly a man who believed himself important. As Henry surveyed the line, his gaze settled on Keanu. Unable to resist, he leaned in with a smirk. "First class, huh?" he remarked, his tone laced with irony. "You never know who might show up here these days." Keanu turned his head and regarded him calmly. "Yeah, life's full of surprises," he replied, his expression unchanged. Henry frowned, caught off guard. He seemed to expect a defensive response, but Keanu didn't give him the satisfaction. Unbothered, Keanu's silence made it clear the remark didn't faze him. Henry, however, wasn't done. "No offense," he continued, chuckling, "but you don't really look like the first-class type. Not every day you see someone so laid back up here." Soon, it was time to board. The first-class line moved forward, and Keanu and Henry handed over their tickets. Henry walked briskly, his stride brimming with self-assuredness, while Keanu moved at his own steady pace, seemingly immune to the surrounding commotion. Inside the plane, the unexpected unfolded. Henry reached his seat and glanced at his ticket again. When he looked up, there was Keanu, calmly settling into the seat right next to him. "You've got to be kidding me," Henry muttered, shaking his head in disbelief. Sitting down, he let out a dry laugh, as though the situation were a cosmic joke. Of all the seats, it had to be this one. Keanu turned to him, still unruffled, and offered a polite smile. "Looks like we're travel companions," he said simply. Henry crossed his arms, trying to mask his discomfort. It wasn't just that he was sitting next to Keanu. What unsettled him more was how the man he'd sized up moments ago was now sharing this exclusive space with him. He couldn't put his finger on why, but something about Keanu's presence left him uneasy. As the last of the economy passengers finished boarding, Henry decided to break the silence, but not in a friendly way. So what do you do for work?" he asked, his tone casual, though it carried the weight of someone fishing for confirmation of what they already believed. Keanu, adjusting his backpack under the seat in front of him, glanced up and replied simply, "I work in film." Henry raised an eyebrow, feigning surprise. "Oh, really? Commercials? Indie stuff?" He pressed. Keanu gave a faint smile and shook his head. "Something like that." Henry chuckled, leaning back slightly. I've always thought it's fascinating how people try to fit in, but sometimes certain places just aren't for everyone, like first class, for example. Keanu studied him briefly, his calm expression unchanged. I think we all end up where we're meant to be, Keanu replied, and sometimes that's exactly where we are. Henry let out a quick laugh. That's nice. Kind of philosophical, but life's not that simple. Keanu didn't respond immediately. Instead, he turned his gaze to the window, signaling the conversation was over, but Henry wasn't done. You know what? He said, leaning in slightly. You might be sitting here, but there are some things money can't buy. Some spaces just don't belong to everyone. This time, Keanu didn't answer with words. He met Henry's gaze with an expression of quiet patience laced with subtle firmness. It was the kind of look that spoke volumes without saying a word. Henry, believing he'd won, leaned back with a smug grin. He thought he'd gained the upper hand, but in truth, the game was only just beginning. Henry felt in control, but Keanu's calm masked something he hadn't anticipated. Each passing moment shifted what seemed like a simple exchange into something far more layered. As the plane ascended and the in-flight service began, the tension lingered. The flight attendant moved through first class, offering drinks. Henry made sure to draw attention. Champagne, he said with a confident smile, something that suits the exclusivity of this seat. The flight attendant nodded politely, used to passengers like him. When it was Keanu's turn, he made a straightforward request. Just water, please. Henry seized the opportunity to comment, grinning as he glanced at Keanu. Water? He asked, laughing lightly. You're really going to waste the first-class experience on water? Keanu accepted the bottle with a calm. I'm fine with this. Sometimes simplicity is enough. Henry squinted, trying to read into the response before retorting. Yeah, I guess that works for people who settle. Not everyone is meant to enjoy the finer things. Keanu took a sip unbothered and waited a beat before replying. Maybe the best is different for everyone. His tone remained as composed as ever. Henry's smirk faltered slightly, but he quickly masked it, unwilling to lose his composure. Other passengers noticed Henry's needling, but with Keanu's unruffled demeanor, no one stepped in. For now, Henry didn't like the subtle shift in control. He exhaled deeply, steadying himself to keep the conversation in check. Maybe those who say things like that just don't understand what truly matters. Some things simply aren't within everyone's reach, The flight attendant, busy serving another passenger, glanced their way briefly, as though debating whether to step in. She seemed to decide otherwise, noticing Keanu was managing the situation just fine. He responded with nothing more than a faint smile before turning back to the window. Henry, however, wasn't content. He clearly wanted to provoke further, but was slowly realizing that Keanu wasn't easily fazed. Henry thought he was winning the exchange. Yet to those nearby, his smugness was increasingly grating. While Keanu maintained his calm demeanor, Henry was on the brink of encountering a lesson that would challenge his entire perspective. The flight attendant returned to their section of the cabin with another round of drinks. Henry, determined to keep the conversation, or rather his provocations, alive, picked up where he left off. Life's a lot like flying first class, he began, swirling his champagne glass for effect. You put in the effort, earn your place, and then you get to enjoy the perks. But some people, well, let's just say they're only here because of luck. Keanu set his water bottle down on the tray table and finally turned toward Henry. His expression remained composed, but there was a sharper clarity in his eyes, signaling he was ready to engage more directly. Luck or hard work, Keanu said calmly. We all touch down in the same place when the flight ends, don't we? His voice was steady, yet the weight of his words seemed to ripple through the cabin. Passengers who had been quietly observing now shifted their attention fully. The air felt heavy with tension. Some exchanged glances, sensing the subtle yet profound clash unfolding. Henry grinned, attempting to mask the subtle sting of Keanu's response. "Well, I wouldn't put it like that. Some of us," he said with a smirk, "are just on a different level. Not everyone understands what it means to deserve being here." Keanu leaned forward slightly, crossing his arms. "I'd say the real value of being here," he gestured toward the cabin, "isn't about what you've got, but how you treat the people around you." The words hung in the air, resonating with an undeniable truth. A few passengers nodded subtly, while others exchanged approving looks. Henry, on the other hand, visibly squirmed. He forced a chuckle, though his discomfort was apparent. That's a good one," he said, his tone dripping with forced sarcasm. "First-class life lessons. Maybe you should start giving motivational speeches." Keanu simply gave a small, knowing smile and turned back toward the window, choosing to let the conversation end without further comment. His silence seemed more powerful than any response he could have given. The passengers reacted quietly but clearly. Some whispered among themselves, while others gave Henry disapproving looks. A couple, seated a few rows back, who appeared to recognize Keanu, stayed quiet out of respect, but exchanged a look of admiration for the way he'd handled the exchange. Henry, meanwhile, began to notice the subtle shift in the cabin. The attention he craved now felt uncomfortable, and the confidence he'd exuded earlier started to falter. Still, he wasn't ready to acknowledge defeat. Henry believed he'd won the argument, but the mood around him told a different story. What he didn't realize was that the real lesson was yet to come, one that would force him to re-evaluate everything he thought he knew about success, power, and respect. As the flight attendant moved through the aisle, gathering empty glasses, Henry seemed intent on dominating the argument he had started. "You know what's funny?" he said, smirking. "People with nothing to show for themselves always preach about humility and simplicity. Ever notice that?" Keanu leaned forward slightly, meeting Henry's gaze. "I've noticed that the ones who brag the most about what they have are often the ones who feel the emptiest inside," he replied. His words lingered in the air, leaving Henry momentarily stunned and struggling for a comeback. Henry opened his mouth, but faltered, searching for the right words. Nearby passengers exchanged glances, some visibly impressed by Keanu's calm response to Henry's provocation. "Look," Henry finally said, recovering his composure, "I'm not trying to be rude, but this is a competitive world. If you don't show off what you've got, people won't even notice you. That's just reality." Keanu leaned back in his seat, his tone steady. "Maybe so," he replied, "but I believe true success doesn't need to be advertised. It speaks for itself." His words seemed to ripple through the cabin. A few passengers nodded discreetly, while others cast disapproving looks at Henry. Clearly unused to being challenged in this way, Henry shifted in his seat. The atmosphere in first class had shifted, with many passengers now paying close attention to the exchange. An older man sitting nearby turned to watch more intently, shaking his head slightly as if in disapproval of Henry's demeanor. Sensing the scrutiny, Henry tried to mask his irritation, but instead of backing down, he threw out another remark. "That's just cheap philosophy," he scoffed. "It sounds nice, but it's not how the real world works." Keanu's expression remained calm as he responded. "The real world is shaped by people, Henry. And in the end, the way we treat others says far more about us than anything we own or achieve." Henry visibly bristled at the comment. Glancing around, he noticed that the passenger's attention had shifted. He was no longer the center of admiration. Some people were whispering to one another, while others stared openly, their expressions ranging from mild curiosity to open disapproval. It was becoming clear to Henry that his usual tactics of asserting dominance weren't landing as he'd hoped. He had entered the exchange feeling confident, but Keanu's steady demeanor and words were altering how the passengers viewed him, and perhaps even how he saw himself. The tension in the cabin was palpable. Henry crossed his arms, attempting to disguise his discomfort, but his irritation was becoming harder to hide. Keanu, unfazed, broke the silence with a measured tone. "Henry," he said, "I see where you're coming from. The world can be competitive, no doubt. But I've learned that the need to prove yourself often comes from something deeper, an insecurity, an internal conflict." Henry raised an eyebrow, unsure if Keanu's comment was meant to provoke or to start an honest dialogue. "Internal conflict," he repeated with a mocking laugh. "I don't know where you got that idea, but you're way off." Keanu smiled faintly, shaking his head. "Maybe I am," he said. "But in my experience, a lot of people think success is all about what others see on the surface. Deep down, they were just trying to fill a void inside themselves." The comment struck Henry unexpectedly, leaving him momentarily silent. He toyed with his wedding ring, his fingers moving as if on autopilot, but he quickly regained his defensive stance. "That's not me," he said sharply. "Everything I've accomplished, I earned through hard work. I don't need anyone telling me how to live my life." Keanu stayed composed, his demeanor calm as though carefully choosing his next words. He studied Henry for a beat before speaking again. "I'm not saying you didn't work hard. I just think we sometimes get so obsessed with showcasing our successes that we forget to reflect on ourselves. Who are we when you strip all this away?" Henry pressed his lips together, visibly uneasy. The question lingered in the air, rattling in his head, though he wasn't ready to admit its weight. With a scoff, he replied, "Who are we? We're what we build. Without that, we're nothing." Keanu didn't flinch, his expression growing more serious. "I don't agree. I think we're defined by what we do for others, not by what we accumulate. In the end, it's not what we show the world that matters, it's what we carry inside." He tapped his chest, and his words reverberated through the cabin. A few passengers subtly nodded, while Henry visibly struggled to maintain his composure. "Easy for you to say," Henry snapped, nearly rising from his seat. "You don't know me. You have no idea what I've been through to get here." Keanu's tone remained steady, firm, but never harsh. "You're right. I don't know your story, but I don't have to know it to recognize that sometimes when someone feels the need to boast about their achievements, it's because they're hiding something. Fear, insecurity, loneliness." The words landed like a heavy blow. Henry froze, his face flushing with a mix of anger and something deeper, shame. His hands curled into fists, his whole body trembling as he fought to stay composed. Finally, his restraint snapped. He leapt to his feet, the motion knocking over his empty champagne glass. "You think you're better than me?" he shouted, his voice cutting through the silence of the cabin. "And sitting there with your clever little lines, acting like you've got life all figured out. You don't know a damn thing about what it's like to live in the real world." All conversation ceased as passengers turned toward the commotion. A flight attendant quickly moved in to calm the situation. Meanwhile, Keanu stayed seated, his gaze steady on Henry. He let the man's tirade play out before replying, his voice even and measured. "I don't think I'm better than you, but I do think that sometimes we need to pause and consider what truly matters. And Henry, you don't have to prove anything to anyone." The words seemed to cut through Henry's anger. His chest heaved as he breathed heavily, the tension in his body slowly ebbing. Finally, he sank back into his seat, his eyes avoiding Keanu's. His anger had faded, leaving only defeat. Henry sat quietly, Keanu's words echoing in his mind. He felt exposed, vulnerable in a way he hadn't experienced before, especially in front of a crowd. But little did he know, the most defining moment of the journey still lay ahead. The rest of the flight unfolded under an uneasy silence. Henry kept his gaze fixed ahead, refusing to acknowledge Keanu. Across the aisle, Keanu remained as relaxed as if nothing had happened. A short time later, a flight attendant approached Keanu, her polite smile warm and reassuring. Her voice drew the attention of everyone in the cabin. "Mr. Keanu, the captain asked me to let you know your connection in Tokyo has been confirmed. He also sends his regards." The name Keanu seemed to hang in the air, especially in first class. Some passengers who had been quietly minding their own business suddenly perked up. Eyes widened and murmurs began rippling through the space. That's when Henry froze. "Keanu," he muttered, as if the name itself was unreal. "Keanu Reeves." Keanu gave the flight attendant a polite nod and a brief thank you, seemingly unaffected by the sudden buzz. He turned his attention back to Henry, who now looked at him like he'd seen a ghost. "Is something wrong, Henry?" Keanu asked with a faint smile. Henry's mouth opened, but no words came out. He glanced around, noticing other passengers glancing at him, some curious, others disapproving. He seemed completely thrown. Sinking into his seat, Henry looked visibly uneasy. He stammered a few words, attempting to explain himself. "I had no idea," he finally managed. "I mean, you didn't say who you were. I didn't know." Keanu stayed calm, his tone gentle but resolute. "I didn't think it mattered. I don't usually introduce myself with my name as if it's some kind of pass." Henry hesitated, then tried to defend himself. "Look, I wasn't trying to offend you. I just didn't realize." Keanu exhaled quietly, leaning forward slightly. "Henry, what you said doesn't change now that you know my name. The truth isn't about who you're talking to, it's about how you choose to treat people." Henry was stunned into silence. He glanced at Keanu, then at the other passengers, who were now even more fixated on the scene. The flush of embarrassment on his face was undeniable. Keanu broke the silence with one last point. "Henry, life's already hard enough for everyone. The last thing anyone needs is someone tearing others down just to feel superior." Henry gave a small nod, unable to come up with a rebuttal. For the first time, he seemed to truly consider his behavior. Keanu leaned back in his seat, signaling that the conversation was over. Meanwhile, Henry sat frozen, staring at his hands as though replaying every word Keanu had said. It wasn't just Keanu that confronted Henry. It was reality itself. In trying to belittle someone, Henry had exposed more about his own character than he intended. The rest of the flight was quiet and heavy with the weight of what had just unfolded. Henry, who earlier seemed so self-assured, now looked visibly uncomfortable. He avoided making eye contact with Keanu or anyone else. The arrogance he carried at the beginning of the journey was replaced by something far closer to shame. As the minutes ticked by, Henry couldn't shake Keanu's words from his mind. Everything he'd said was so straightforward, yet it hit Henry on a much deeper level. He started to reflect on his own behavior, recalling the countless times he'd judged people without taking a moment to truly understand them. "Maybe he's right," he muttered under his breath, unaware he'd spoken aloud. He glanced over at Keanu, who was calmly reading a book as if their conversation hadn't happened at all. That sense of calm only made the moment hit harder. Keanu hadn't tried to justify himself or argue. Instead, he let his actions do the talking. As the plane began its descent, Henry finally found the nerve to break the silence. Turning to Keanu, his gaze still downcast, he said, "I owe you an apology. Not for anything you did, but because of how I acted. I was arrogant. I behaved like a jerk." Keanu looked up at him, his expression as calm as ever. After a brief pause, Keanu replied, "Thanks for saying that. But more importantly, I hope you learned something from this." Henry nodded slowly, sensing the weight behind those words. They weren't just a response, they were an invitation to grow. Keanu added, "Sometimes, the things we're searching for the most are the things we lack within ourselves. I hope you figure out what really matters." Henry didn't say another word, but Keanu's message stayed with him. He knew this moment could spark something inside if he let it. After they disembarked, Henry stood still in the terminal, watching Keanu disappear into the crowd. He noticed how fans approached Keanu for photos and greetings, and how Keanu responded to each person with patience and a genuine smile. There was no rush, no ego, just an authentic kindness that radiated naturally. Henry glanced down at his own hands, lost in thought. He realized something needed to change within himself. Keanu's words echoed in his mind, reminding him that true value isn't about achievements or status. It's about how you treat the people around you. As Keanu faded into the busy airport, Henry felt something new: hope. Maybe their meeting wasn't a random coincidence. Maybe it was a chance for him to begin again. At the end of the day, the choices we make shape who we are. Are we living to impress others, or to grow into better versions of ourselves? Keanu's words carried a powerful truth. Real success isn't measured by accomplishments or accolades. It's measured by the positive difference you make in the world and in the lives of others. So next time you're faced with a moment of judgment or conflict, remember that respect and humility never go out of style. And perhaps the change you want to see in the world starts with you. If you enjoyed this story, we invite you to explore more inspiring tales of hope, compassion, and resilience by clicking on the screen.